I think if there was anything I was naive about in the 90s and 2000s, it wasn't the potential of technology to do evil. It was a failure to grasp the extent to which competition enforcers had given up on doing their jobs and how
Right.
easy it would be for tech firms to monopolize the internet and then operate with near total impunity because they would be too big to regulate. It's not just Google users who are being bombarded with ads, it's Google advertisers who are paying 5 times as much for worse targeting and more ad fraud. It creates a class alliance between business customers and end users against the firm. And I think we often miss this when we advocate as though we were consumer advocates. A lot of people, I think, have unwisely bought into AI boosters' tale that AI can do our jobs. I don't think AI can do your job, but I really do believe that an AI salesman can convince your boss to fire you and replace you with an AI that can't do your job.
I don't want to start by talking about this, but at the same time, we also have to talk about the elephant in the room. So,
Sure.
as a person of Jewish descent, what is it like to be a writer in the present climate?
The extent to which Israel has been a rogue state has increased in the last 2 years, but it's not a novel phenomenon. And the descent into a kind of cult-like genocidal Zionism among so many Jews and their rejection of Jews who don't toe the line on Israel has been on the rise for decades. I have relations who think I'm a Holocaust denier because I don't support Israeli genocide, right? They assume that these two are sort of eternally coterminal. I don't think, I should note I'm an atheist, but I don't think there's anything culturally or religiously incompatible with opposing Israel and its apartheid state and the genocide it's prosecuting, and either religious cultural identity or religious faith identity, Jewish faith identity. I think that there's, a very good case to be made that never again means never again to anyone anywhere. And given how many times I've heard Jewish cultural and religious figures say that, I like to think that I am a better keeper of that faith than they are.
It's also especially prescient now, talking about the Jewish faith and the kind of anti-Zionism, especially knowing that like right now the Superman movie is like doing the rounds, and there's like a lot of furor over the portrayal. I haven't seen the movie actually, but like over the portrayal that Superman is being seen as some sort of anti-Zionist figure, and that kind of brings it back to the concept of Superman, and the defense has been that Superman has been that figure from the beginning, that
Sure.
he was actually a creator. He was created by anti-Zionist, unless I'm
I don't know.
mistaken.
I don't know if
Yeah.
Siegel and Schuster were anti-Zionist.
Hmm.
They are Canadians. They are Jewish, just like me, in both counts. But I do think that there's a strong case for interpreting Superman, the Superman story, as a story about alienness, and as a story about horror of genocide. So, one of the things about Siegel and Schuster is that they conceived of that character at a time when the U.S. was isolationist, and was refusing to fight in World War II on the grounds that it was a Jewish war, as a war to save Jews, which they didn't want to enter. And so there's a certain wish fulfillment there, where Superman can be seen as a kind of golem, which is a figure out of Eastern European Jewish mythology, who's a kind of supernatural, all-powerful kind of robot that saves Jews from pogroms, from ethnic cleansing. And I've written multiple science fiction stories about this. I wrote a story called The Superman and the Bug Out about this, and then I wrote a novella called Model Minority also about this, and the idea that America's or white supremacy's willingness to tolerate people in the whiteness category is always contingent on their willingness to endorse white supremacy. And I think it's a lot of people fail to understand that the U.S. support for genocide in Israel is driven not by Jews, but by evangelicals. That for every Jew who identifies as a Zionist in America, there are 30 evangelical Christians who identify as Zionists. So Jews are an insignificant minority of American Zionism. It is driven primarily by religious maniacs, and I think that those people would happily throw Jews out of the whiteness boat if we become inconvenient. And I think, I think it highlights the extent to which whiteness is a social category and not an ethnic one. You see this also in the treatment of certain South Asians in among far right groups who welcome them as fellow ethno nationalists to the extent that they embrace Modi, but if they believe in reconciliation in Kashmir or reconciliation with Pakistan, they're treated as sort of affiliates, branch offices of Al Qaeda.
Can you talk a little bit about how you have your formative stages as a writer? Because you kind of had an interesting beginning where you were part of the tech world as well. You were doing entrepreneurial work, you were doing open source work, you were kind of you founded a organizations that were engaged in open source advocacy. So talk a little bit about how the internet was at the time and like the tech space was when you were beginning, and also as a writer, being outside looking in, where you were simultaneously writing sci-fi that was daring to imagine both the dystopian and the futuristic versions of the tech that you were part of.
Well, I began as a writer long before the tech bubble. I started writing short stories when I was 6 years old, and that's when I knew I wanted to be a science fiction writer. And I grew up in a milieu, Toronto in the 1970s and 80s, where we had the closest thing that anyone has ever seen to a formal apprenticeship for science fiction writers. And it was thanks to a radical writer, critic, and editor named Judith Merrill. Judy had been married to Frederick Pohl, another science fiction writer, and they divorced in 1968 at the same time as the US erupted in political violence, particularly in the city they lived in Chicago. There were what became known as the Chicago police riots, where the police cracked down on anti war protesters and on the journalists covering the protests. And for the first time, really, Americans got to see how anti war protests were being treated because journalists dropped their longstanding practice of whitewashing police treatment of protesters. And Judy was so appalled that she decided she didn't want to raise her kids in America anymore. And so she went into self-imposed exile. She moved to Toronto, where I lived. And she brought her books. She'd gotten the books in the divorce with Fred. She donated them to the Toronto Public Library System. They formed the nucleus of what's now the largest science fiction reference collection in the world. It's called the Merrill Collection. And Judy was the writer in residence there. She also was quite good at organizing lots of community and cultural events that she could do. So she used to introduce Doctor Who on public television every week. And so my
Hmm.
mom was in teachers college at the time. My dad would be at home with me and my baby brother, and we'd watch Judy Merrill on TV introducing Doctor Who. And she would kind of take you through the origin story of each of the tropes in these Doctor Who episodes, having been there at their creation. She was a member of the legendary Futurian House in New York, a group of radical science fiction writers who were barred from attending the first Hugo banquet for being too left.
Wow.
And had participated in the creation of science fiction as we understand it. And so I knew her from watching TV. My dad was a pal of hers from radical politics. My dad had been a professional revolutionary before going back to become a computer scientist and then a computer science teacher, math and computer science teacher. And so we used to watch her. And then when my school went on a trip when I was about 10 years old to her library and I met her, I already knew who she was. And she said, "Look, kids, if you write stories, you bring them to me and I'll help you make them better." So I had a transit pass. I just started getting on the subway and going down to her library at the weekend to have her critique my stories. Uh, that was very powerful. But even more powerful was Judy's practice of putting writers who were writing at about the same level together and teaching them how to run peer workshops and giving them space in the library. So you say, you guys have got Tuesday nights. Here's how it works. Here's the back room. Go to it. And would let us run these peer workshops. And I workshopped with some incredible Canadian writers. She really was kind of the mother of Canadian science fiction. She also founded a kind of movable feast called Toronto Hydra, where every 6 weeks or 2 months, you get together in a different science fiction professional's home, throw in a few bucks for potluck, and every writer, critic, editor, filmmaker, TV producer, effects person, illustrator working in science fiction would attend. And so I got to know all of my peers. I also worked for a time at a bookstore, Baca, the science fiction bookstore, which is now the oldest science fiction bookstore in the world. It was founded when Judith Merril arm twisted a local fan into starting a science fiction store. The writing workshop at my great alternative high school, a school I stayed in for 7 years to get a 4-year diploma, in large part because I wanted to keep going to go to this workshop. I hadn't known this at the time, but 10 years before I arrived, Judy had started that workshop through a writer in the school's grants program. Uh, so everywhere I looked, there was Judith Merril's fingerprints all over everything. The first magazine that ever published one of my stories was a Canadian science fiction magazine called On Spec. She had bullied some fans out west into starting that. I really always had this connection to technology. We got a terminal connected to the university by an acoustic coupler in 1977 when I was 6 years old. And that was the year I started writing science fiction too. So there was never a time when I wasn't doing both. During the dot-com bubble, well, I should say having graduated from that high school after spending 7 years getting a 4-year diploma, I found myself quite ruined for undergraduate education because I'd basically been directing my own education in the manner of, say, a master's program for several years at that point. I dropped out
Right.
of 4 undergraduate programs in 2 years, never got a degree, and dropped out to become a hacker, a programmer, working for a great multimedia firm called Voyager. And then I started as a freelance web developer. In fact, I started as a freelance Gopher developer. I had this idea that someone would pay me to build Gopher sites for them. I finally
Hmm.
got a sucker on the hook. And then that week, I saw NCSA Mosaic, and I went into the office and I was like, guys, you don't want to pay me to make a Gopher site for you. You want to pay me to make a website for you. And so I
Hmm.
started making websites. And then some of the people who had been my clients and also my colleagues and I founded a free open source software startup called Open Cola that we
Hmm.
raised capital for in the capital markets. And that was a peer to peer open source search tool. It has been revived by some of our former programmers. They demoed it last year at DEF CON. It's very exciting that they're doing this. We were a casualty of the dot-com crash before we could ship a functional product, really, a commercial product. And I ended up quitting my job at the company I'd started when our venture capitalists came in and started squeezing us, and going to work for the
Hmm.
Electronic Frontier Foundation. And all through this time, I'd been writing novels and stories and had been editing things, and I had also started writing Boing Boing, this weblog that I helped start, that I still co-own, but that I wrote every day for 19 years. I wrote more than 50,000 posts for them. And so I had a profile as someone who could write and think about technology both as critical matter and as an allegory in science fiction. And oftentimes the two sides of the argument would be carried on through two different means.
Right. Yeah, that's like pretty extensive that you and you also perfectly set me up to ask you. Science fiction and tech always seem to have like this both the good to and evil to and sort of relationship, where on the one hand a sci-fi is directly is accurately predicting the dystopian versions of tech, and then somehow tech is also deriving from it, like seems to be getting ideas from sci-fi. And at the same time, it's also pertinent that like you emerge from a sort of radical politics that enters you into the open source world, which is definitely, I mean, like immediately to my mind, Aaron Schwartz comes to my mind, and like people have actually sacrificed their lives for the sake of like this software and computer products being free for all, like internet products being free for everybody, free for use. So can you speak a little bit about how the politics of open source shaped up in your journey, and like the politics of open source at large?
Well, I should say I was never really an open source person. I was always a free software person.
Hmm.
I think free software is a somewhat unfortunate name. I think Richard Stallman, who came up with it, miscalculated. I think he believed that if you told people that you were working on free software, that the ambiguity as to whether you meant libre or gratis, whether you meant free as in speech or free as in beer, at no cost or with no restriction, that paradox would prompt a kind of colloquy. that people go, oh, free software, what does that mean? And that you could explain it to them. And it turns out that people just don't like being confused, and very few people, or not nearly as many people as Richard hoped, wanted to have that discussion. But the advantage of free software as a name, even if it's not the one I might have picked, is that it stressed an ethical value. It stressed freedom, the ability of technology to deliver and enhance and protect human freedom. And open source really just stresses transparency, which is a precondition for freedom. But you can have transparency without freedom,
Mm.
right? If ICE revealed the identities of every goon who is grabbing a migrant and sending them to a concentration camp, we would have total transparency. It wouldn't make us any freer. And what happened in the years after open source was coined, and when it was coined, it really did mean the same thing as free software. It was just a rebrand of the idea. But what happened in the years that ensued is that there were a series of junctures where we had to assess whether some conduct, some practice, some technological design pattern was within or outside of our movement. And those decisions, even if they didn't necessarily have the force of law, although sometimes they would, depending on whether they were adjudicated to be within or without the bounds of the license conditions, they carried a lot of social and normative pressure. And given that both free software and open source in large part run on goodwill, actions that were viewed as beyond the pale or a betrayal of the principle would be harder to carry off, because you wouldn't get as many people volunteering to contribute on the basis of your choices about how you want to approach the technology. And when all we stressed was openness at each one of these junctures, particularly with things like cloud computing, we asked, oh, well, is the source code available? Right? Like, you can see the back end for pretty much all of Google's cloud stack, or Microsoft Azure or whatever. It's all just sitting there on GitHub. So you have open source. If you want, you can do some volunteer work for Google, and you can like do some pull requests with bug fixes and so on. But you don't have free software. If your app loops through Google's cloud, and it's hard to find a program that doesn't loop through someone's cloud these days for authentication
Mm.
or some other aspect, you don't get to decide how that cloud is configured. Only the firm that runs that cloud, one of 4 or 5 very large firms, gets to decide how that's configured, and therefore gets to decide the inner and outer boundaries of what your program can do. And so they have software freedom, and we have open source. And the open source movement was in part driven by a desire to promote a methodology, right? This
Mm.
this superior methodology of openness. It was driven in part, not in whole, by an ideological opposition to the free as in freedom component, right? My friend Stephen Bruce, who's another radical science fiction fantasy writer, says that one of the ways to tell whether someone is a leftist is you ask what's more important, property rights or human rights. And if they say property rights are a human right, they're not on the left. And
Mm.
so, one of the only ways that you could have software freedom in a world of these distributed apps that loop through different clouds is by having license restrictions that curbed how people use their private property, how they use their cloud servers. And there is a kind of libertarian wing of the open source movement that felt that that was beyond the pale, because they view, not only do they view property rights as a human right, they see property rights as the right from which all human rights descend. Which I think if you're a leftist, you're like, so wait, if we have a city with 1 million homeless people and 1 million empty flats, that human rights are better served by leaving the homeless people on the streets rather than moving them into the flats because the people who own the flats would be sad. That doesn't
Mm.
sound like a human rights enhancing idea, and yet the kind of libertarian position is quite the reverse. And so this is a foundational division. And so some of that was what drove open source, right? An ideological opposition to weakening of property rights in favor of human rights. And some of it was just a genuine feeling that the branding sucked, that explaining what you meant by free was not a thing you got to do. There's that old saying, if you're explaining, you're losing.
Right.
And so, I'm a free software person, and I'm a free software person because I've always felt that technology has a role to play in safeguarding, providing, and enhancing human rights. And I also have always believed that technology presents a danger to human thriving. And I don't think anyone gets involved with something like Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I've worked for 24 years, because you think everything's going to be fine, right? There's a
Right.
kind of revisionist history of the sort of technology liberation movement that says that we were naive because we thought that if we just gave everyone a computer and an internet connection, there'd never be, it would never lead to ethnic cleansing or genocide or whatever. It'd all be fine. And in fact, I think the only reason to get involved with something like EFF is, on the one hand, you have to be quite animated by the possibilities for human society that technology represents, but you also have to be terrified of what happens if it goes wrong. And that has always been my position. And I think if there's anything I was naive about in the 90s and 2000s, it wasn't the potential of technology to do evil. It was a failure to grasp the extent to which competition enforcers had given up on doing their jobs, and how
Right.
easy it would be for tech firms to monopolize the internet and then operate with near total impunity because they would be too big to regulate. Too big to fail means too big to care.
So this like basically directly brings us to the conversation about enshittification, a term of your coinage, where basically tech firms are building worse and worse products and trapping users. If I'm like getting the sense right, like they're
No, that's
basically
all right.
trapping users into basically they're onboarding users for nothing, and then they're like just sucking the users dry by making them pay more and more and more for less and less and less over time. So do you think like this basically enshittification is a direct reflection of the monopolization of tech? And I also feel like that an additional question would be, do you feel like the enshittification is also kind of another symptom of enshittification is the sort of I don't think the open source movement's spiritual successor is the decentralization thing that crypto people talk about, but it does seem to have hijacked the whole sense of like
Mhm.
decentralization seems to have hijacked the conversation away from open source and free software. Or am I misreading the situation? So can you speak to both of
Mhm.
those?
A slight gloss on enshittification is that it's not solely focused on how users perform on platforms. And I think this is an important point, is that platforms aren't just bad to their users, they're bad to their business customers too, right? It's not just Uber riders who are paying twice as much, it's Uber drivers who are getting paid half as much. It's not just Google users who are being bombarded with ads, it's Google advertisers who are paying 5 times as much for worse targeting and more ad fraud. And the reason that this matters is that it creates a class alliance between business customers and end users against the firm. And I think we often miss this when we advocate as though we were consumer advocates, which is to say, we think only about the consumer side of the story. A lot of people, I think, have unwisely bought into AI boosters' tale that AI can do our jobs. I don't think AI can do your job, but I really do believe that an AI salesman can convince your boss to fire you and replace you with an AI that can't do your job. And the reason that distinction matters is, if you're, say, a radiologist who's worried about having your job taken away by an AI that can identify solid mass tumors on x rays, which is a thing that AIs are reasonably good at doing, or at least the ones that they miss are different from the ones that humans miss. And you run around telling people the AI is going to take my job, and therefore your chest x rays will be more reliable and cheaper. Most people are going to say, like, I'm sorry for you, but that actually sounds okay to me. But
Hmm.
if you understand that what AI is there to do is to see 99 out of 100 radiologists fired, and the one who remains being put in charge of quote unquote reviewing the AI's judgments to be the so called human in the loop at a speed that precludes any kind of real examination, and reveals that their real role is to be the accountability sink and the human crumple zone for the AI, the person who gets blamed when the AI kills someone, then everyone who's worried they might get cancer is on the same side as the radiologist. And so, if you want to make a difference, you have to understand that there is a class alliance between the buy side and the sell side against the intermediary. And so, enshittification is about not just the buy side, right? Not just the end user, but about the vendors as well who use the platform: eBay sellers, publishers on Facebook, publishers on Google, app makers on Google and Apple's app stores, games publishers on the major consoles and so on. They are class allies with the end users. And the thesis of enshittification is that we used to get pretty good intermediation from companies run by pretty bad people when those bad people were afraid of consequences, when they had to face competitors, regulators, workplace revolts, and technology itself, the repurposing of technology to undo whatever mischief they did. You know, you make printer ink very, very expensive and you write a program that blocks generic printer ink. And that opens the door for someone who makes generic printer ink to write a new program for your printer and sell them both to your customers. And then 5 years later, they bought all their ink from this third party, and that third party's been providing their drivers as well. And it's time to buy a new printer, and they just buy the printer from that guy.
Hmm.
And so that's a thing that used to stay the hand of bad people running firms, which made their firms pretty good. And the collapse of external sources of discipline, the permission of firms to merge to monopoly and engage in anti-competitive conduct that prevented new market entry. So think of Google spending, $25 billion a year for many years to prevent anyone from ever encountering a search box that wasn't wired into Google's servers, so that no one would ever make a new search engine, because why bother if no one's ever going to encounter it? Um, the tolerance for that created a monopoly, created cartels. Those cartels found it very easy to capture their regulators. 100 companies are a squabbling rabble, 5 companies are a cozy conspiracy. And especially because it's easy for them to divide up the turf and decide who's going to operate in which sector, and not compete head to head, at least not in their main lines of business, they have extraordinary profits because their profits aren't being competed away by having major competitors. And as a result, they have extraordinary amounts of capital to spend on regulatory capture. And so you lose regulation when you lose competition. Um, Tech workers, for a long time, at least in North America and Europe, enjoyed an enormous amount of labor power because they were in such high demand. And they failed to grasp that labor power arose from the temporary condition of a supply demand mismatch. They thought that they were temporarily embarrassed founders, that they were, sort of viewed as peers by their bosses. So they never contemplated unionizing when they were strong. And then we reached a point where, we lost 500,000 tech jobs in 3 years in the United States alone, and tech workers' power just went away. And then finally, the entertainment industry and the tech industry have colluded to get the US trade representative to convince every country in the world to ban reverse engineering and modification of products and services, so that interoperability risk of a better technology coming along that disenshittifies whatever you've enshittified goes away. So now you have the same people running these companies in many cases, Mark Zuckerberg or Sergey Brin going back to Google right as it gets even worse. So these guys, they used to run their companies well when they were afraid of consequences. Now that there's no consequences, they run their companies very badly. It takes an awful lot of window dressing and maybe a PhD in economics to make this fairly simple explanation for what's going on seem implausible. They want to say that it's like the great forces of history and the iron laws of economics, and not an official tolerance for monopolies that produced monopolies that do the things that monopolies have always done.
I'm really glad that like more mainstream, especially outlets, are also like covering your work right now. And another person who's having kind of like a moment in a different vein is Bill Burr, who has been like saying for a long time, the comedian. He's been making jokes about how tech kind of peaked in the mid 90s and everything has been going down since then. And he just like makes this joke about Steve. He attributes that to Steve Jobs, and how Steve Jobs like had this orientation towards product, and it was always about the experience, and it never really cared about innovation and so on. And now, I mean, of course, like we have successors who are even worse than that, in Elon Musk and all these people. So given all of that, there are, I feel, these two pathways, and I have to note here that you're a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, if I'm not mistaken. There are like pathways, there are conversations about breaking and nationalizing big tech. What do you think? And like, in terms of both like from a realistic standpoint as well as from the standpoint of a path forward that should be the most effective, what do you think is the way forward? Can these companies be actually regulated into not merging and monopolizing, or do you have to make them as big as possible and turn the products into public utilities? and so
So
on.
we've had this extraordinary uprising of antitrust, pro-competition, anti-monopoly activism all over the world for the last 5 or 6 years. And the thing that makes it especially extraordinary is that political science says that it should be impossible. The political science literature is pretty clear that when there's a priority that wealthy elites have, it doesn't matter how unpopular it is among the rest of us, they get their way, and vice versa. No matter how popular something is among the great mass of people, if wealthy elites don't like it, it doesn't go anywhere. And yet, in Europe and in some of the EU countries like Germany, France, Spain, in the UK, in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, under Trump and under Biden and under Trump too, in China, in South Korea, and Japan, we have seen this enormous vigor in suing companies in monopolization cases, in bringing breakup remedies, which is what the Trump's DOJ asked for in the Google antitrust case. Google lost 3 monopolization cases last year. I think we lose track of just how incredible this is. And so this all raises the question: what do we do? If we can make these companies small enough to regulate, and I think that's the important thing. I think a lot of our regulatory energy in the last 20 years has been aimed at making them behave better. I think that's a fool's errand. I don't think that they are. It matters whether they behave well or bad. I think the problem is that they have too much power, and if we say to them, okay, well, you have to you know, monitor your platform for hate speech and harassment and disinformation, what you're really saying is you have to exercise total control over your users. You have to be able to spy on everything they say and interdict them when they speak to one another. And I think that you can't make big tech better. You have to make it less powerful. I think that the answer to the fact that these bad things happen on tech platforms needs to be to make the management of the tech platform less important to our lives. I think the only reason people from marginalized identities are hanging around on platforms where they're being harassed is that those platforms have become so central, right? They're where their customers or their audiences or their family or the people with the same rare disease or their colleagues or their fellow students, it's where they all gather. And so we need to break that power up so that the individual decisions of people like Mark Zuckerberg just don't matter as much. I think it's a fool's errand to try and find a better Mark Zuckerberg. I think we should just have no Mark Zuckerberg. In terms of the approach we should take, a lot of people have thought about replacing tech with public services. And I think there's something to that. But services are not the hard part. We have quite a lot of services being produced by civil society, by the private sector at all scales, small and medium-sized enterprises and very large firms. And we also have public services being produced by public entities. What we lack is public goods. And public goods are things like open standards that are very robustly managed so that the standards committee can't be captured by a large firm or a cartel of large firms. It's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do that requires a big muscular state that's extremely capable and has a lot of tech nous. Also, infrastructure can be a public good. So that's things like fiber, data centers, bug bounty programs and bug maintenance programs, security research that identifies bugs and widely used services. Those are public goods. If we have a robust set of public goods, right, everything you need to replicate a tech stack, then one of the things that can run on top of that is a public service as the kind of reference implementation. But utility, I think, implies that you just get one, right? And I
Right.
think there's this naive idea that social media, the natural number of social media networks is one. I think that's wrong. I think that what's truer to say is that once social media networks all can talk to each other, when they have common protocols that are, again, public goods, then it doesn't matter which social media network you're on because they're all intercommunicating. I dream of a day when what you know to a certainty is who you're talking to, but what you neither know nor care about is what protocol, what network, what client, or what operating system they're using, where it's as weird to know that a message originated on Blue Sky versus Mastodon, say, as it would be to know what SIM your friend had in their phone when they sent you a text message. It just shouldn't matter. That should be their business, not your business.